Thanks to Acast for hosting and monetizing this podcast. Oh, hi. Hello there. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I'm your host, Liv. And today, I am here with a special conversation episode, and on a Tuesday, no less. I sat down with author and past guest of the show, Jennifer Saint, to talk all about her new novel, Elektra, and generally the stories of Clytemnestra, Elektra, and Cassandra, who are the voices in this book. Lord knows I could talk about Clytemnestra forever, so I was thrilled to not only get an advanced copy of the book to read, but also to have Jenny back on the show. Plus, just a brag that she listened to the podcast while writing the book, and I'm even in the acknowledgements. It's just fun. We had so much fun chatting about these characters. They're all so fascinating and brilliant, and I was so excited to hear about how Jenny approached writing their stories, how she handled certain things, what sources she was particularly interested in. What's so fascinating about this story is that it spans the Iliad and the Odyssey to an extent, but then it also is the only story from Greek myth that's featured in plays by all three of the surviving tragedians. And they would have been so many hundreds of years after whatever was Homer. There's so many novels lately about the Trojan War and the women involved in the war itself, and they're great. But I think that it was high time for a novel featuring the darker and yet so sympathetic side of Clytemnestra. And Elektra and Cassandra, sure, but I fucking love Clytemnestra and all her righteous anger. And obviously, all the Agamemnon hate. I am always here to shit on Agamemnon, and Jenny was here with me for it. We had such a great conversation. I could talk about this story for hours and hours. So I will just now turn it over to the actual conversation. Making sure you pick up a copy of Elektra. It's out now in the UK and in North America. And, well, enjoy this incredibly fun, interesting, and insightful conversation about these myths and how Jenny went about turning them into a novel. This is episode 161, day 42, still planning to kill Agamemnon, a conversation with Ariadne and Elektra author Jennifer Saint. Why don't we start with this is when I also realize how much I love the conversational part of these things. And then when I talk to authors, I'm like, oh God, this should really be an interview. So that's where my brain goes off into a bunch of different places. So feel free to very much make this conversational versus feeling like you're being interviewed. Let's just chat about these wonderful people because that's what I love to do. But particularly these characters. So I'm completely obsessed with the idea of the curse of the House of Atreus and all of these women. So how did you pick them? Were you always wanting to do this story? They're so different from Ariadne, I guess. So why these three ladies?
And thank you for making it conversational. I think it's so much easier than feeling
good,
like a list of questions. Why these three women is really what you said about it being different to Ariadne. That was a really key motivator for me. I wanted to immerse myself in a completely different world, and I felt with Ariadne the story is so much about gods and magic, and that's something that I love about Greek mythology. But also when you're into the Trojan War and you're into Clytemnestra's story, Elektra's story, there is so much more so much more scope for human error in these human decisions, and the gods feel like they're kind of a little step back, they're a little bit removed. So although they've still got this powerful influence on the story, this seemed like a really interesting kind of meaty psychological kind of thing to get my teeth into, which was really appealing to do after writing Ariadne. And it kind of became those three, because something that I was really really keen to do, possibly as a result of reading so much Greek mythology, was to explore the idea of female rage, and that was kind of the starting point. It was about anger, because I think, especially as a woman, you are probably, we're kind of conditioned from a young age to suppress our anger, and it quite often comes out turned against ourselves rather than turned externally on the world. So to have these three women who turn that anger outwards, Cassandra a little bit less so, but certainly Clytemnestra and Electra and Cassandra in places, that was just, that they seemed like such brilliant characters to delve into for that reason, to kind of really go somewhere different and somewhere new and somewhere where I didn't feel very confident at the start. I felt like I had to do so much to put myself inside their heads. That was really, really challenging, and I felt like that's going to make it rewarding. That's going to make it a really good story.
Yeah, absolutely. And Electra's so interesting too, because, well, in Clytemnestra, like, I just love Clytemnestra, yes. That murderous woman, like, she's my favorite. Mm-hmm. But Electra's anger is so interesting because I think, if coming from a modern like reading of it and like modern feminism, like, I get so annoyed with mm-hmm. Elektra for where her anger is placed, because I'm like, I think you should decide with your mother. Like, your mother's making, I mean, maybe not saying making the right call and like straight up murdering Agamemnon, but like Clytemnestra's anger feels so valid. And then to have Elektra just be so on the other side of it is so interesting. And yeah, like, it must have been really fascinating to kind of get into that mindset too, where like you can sort of understand why Elektra feels the way she does, but also you definitely understand like why Clytemnestra feels the way she does.
Yeah, Clytemnestra is so very righteous in her anger, and I suppose kind of coming to it, I found it so much simpler to get inside Clytemnestra's head, so much easier, and she's also in the way that she's treated in the ancient sources. So I quite often come back to the Odyssey. That's quite often just like there's so much in it, obviously, and
it's my favorite. So yeah. I'm with you.
So coming to Clytemnestra in the Odyssey, even though it's so sort of a minor part of it, when Odysseus visits the underworld, when he speaks to the shade of Agamemnon, and Agamemnon is saying, my wife is so terrible, my wife murdered me. Fair enough, he's annoyed with her, I understand that. But and saying to Odysseus, you have so much of a better wife, your wife is faithful, your wife is enduring, you're going to go home and you're going to be welcomed a lot more kindly than I was. And it's always that comparison between women. Women are just always held up against one another. And nobody at any point, as far as I can see, is ever comparing Odysseus and Agamemnon as husbands. Both of them are terrible.
Yeah.
So, why compare the wives? Because that's what people always do. And with Clytemnestra, she's kind of a monster through the lens of the patriarchy. She is this kind of nightmare woman who isn't just going to do what she's told. She's not going to do what's expected of her. She's going to spend that time while Agamemnon's away at war taking control and taking power, and she's going to take her revenge on him. So I really loved that idea of her as being this terrifying woman. But actually what drives her is her maternal love. It's the fact that she is so devoted to Iphigenia, and she's not going to let her daughter go unavenged. So there's something really beautiful about her anger, and something that I could really, really connect to on that very visceral level. Whereas you're right, with Elektra, especially coming to it from a modern mindset, she's kind of fanatical, and she's kind of driven by ideas about her family honour and religion, and she really wants to preserve the status quo. So kind of getting her perspective was a little bit more difficult, but in terms of her character, she is so very much like her mother, and I think that's why they clash so badly. And they are just both so immovable, and they're so fixed on this is the right thing to do, that neither of them are aware of the consequences around them, and that dynamic between them. And I don't think it's obviously extreme, but I think it's not an unusual mother-daughter dynamic to really grate against the things that make you like your mother, and really come up against that kind of that barrier to understanding. And so that felt real, and that felt like something that actually did make sense. And I suppose that was the way into Elektra's character and the way to unlocking her. But she definitely took a lot longer for me. And the novel didn't start out being Elektra, it started out being Clytemnestra. And then over the course of writing and rewriting, Elektra came more and more to the foreground, and in the end it built so much towards her that she ended up with the title spot.
I was wondering about that too, yeah, because like, I mean, it's interesting because of like her as a character. But she's so fascinating, and I do think you're right. Like you can kind of get into her mind just purely from like everything around her and kind of how she gets there, because it's so very much like, you know, she basically, most of her knowledge of her family is of her mother, and so her father kind of lives in this like other world in her head of like sort of an invented person. And then so she loves him more and like fights against her mother because she's around her mother all the time. And I can see that in like teenagers generally, right? Like it's like you want to love the parent who's like this sort of like idea in your head versus the one that's in front of you, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, first of all, the only way that anyone can love Agamemnon is if they don't know him. So
exactly.
there's like no other way to find him in any way palatable. So she's got to invent him, and that was one of the first, because obviously like we've talked before about timelines and chronology and none of it making sense. And so
the fun of that.
So when it comes to Elektra, she comes into the tragedies as a fully grown woman, but I don't think, as far as I can tell, that we get a very clear sense of her age, and certainly not how old she was when Agamemnon went to war. And for her to actually have this obsession with him, I thought, well, he must have gone when she was too small to have formed, you know, kind of a real judgment of the kind of person that he is. And that allows her to then mythologize him. And then when he comes back, she's in her teenage years, which is a tricky time anyway, and certainly for parental relationships. And so, yeah, she definitely made sense to me as a teenager, so very stuck in that vision of like, my life would be so much better if my father was here, if he'd never gone away. Things were perfect once, they could be again, you know, without any kind of real understanding of who he really is or what it would have been like if he'd stayed.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think you're right about the age too, because like Iphigenia is the oldest, and she's killed when she's marriageable age, which is like what, 14? Gross.
Yep.
So it makes sense that Elektra could be, you know, anywhere from like 5 to 10. Like we only know that Orestes is a baby, and then otherwise we kind of like have this sort of liminal space about how old anyone is. And I have to say, I do love that you have Chrysothemis in it too, because she's often like not in the story at all.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm always so interested in sisterly relationships, and to have kind of, obviously, if Iphigenia is dead, but Chrysothemis, I really struggle with her name, so
I like make a guess. I don't even know, but
it doesn't flow very easily. So yeah, but when she's in the tragedies, she's kind of, you know, she sort of sympathizes a little bit with Elektra, but she's not going to go as far as Elektra. So that seemed like something to kind of to like delve into, a bit like with Ariadne and Phaedra, the way that I thought they would probably react differently to the Minotaur. Just this way that, you know, you can have the same childhood experience, but for Chrysothemis, she's going to go down that more sort of traditional route, I suppose, of complying, of being obedient, of doing what she's told, however she feels about it. But Elektra, she's so much Clytemnestra's daughter. She just can't do that.
Yeah, that's so true. I hadn't really ever thought of them in that way of just like, I mean, the what makes them so different is that they are the same and they each have these things they have to hold on to at the cost of like anything else.
Mm.
And
So,
I just love these characters so much. It was so just generally exciting. But also the curse. So I'm just like, I love the whole idea of the curse, you know, on the House of Atreus, specifically because it's like it's the Tantalid curse, and then it's the curse of the Peloponnai, and then it's the Atreide curse, and you're like, this family is so cursed that their curse has 3 different names as it like rolls through the generations. But then looking at the women involved is especially interesting because like technically speaking Elektra is the only one like by blood in this curse, but obviously the curse affects like Clytemnestra and Cassandra, and so it's an interesting way to look at it in that way. And like obviously I'm pro just looking at everything from the lens of the women involved. So like how do you feel about the curse? Like why was that kind of your thing? I noticed it's in like all the copy and stuff too, so just generally interested in the like the approach to the curse itself.
yeah, I think that really came from not actually from Greek mythology. I was partly inspired, and definitely in terms of the curse and these ideas about how much of this is free will and how much of this is fate. And I really went back to Macbeth for that. And that is the
Mm.
English teacher that I can never get rid of from my psyche. It will always be a part of me. Because I just used to love teaching Macbeth. I used to, and you'd think with teenagers, the age group I taught, that like Romeo and Juliet would be the one because it's all about kind of teenage love and all the rest of it. But it was Macbeth that used to grip them the most when we did Macbeth. And it is just that idea of how much of your fate is inevitable and how much of it do you have a choice over. And it's the way that in this like you said, threefold curse in Greek mythology, you feel like there's a way out for each generation, but each of them doesn't take it. So they just make it worse and worse until it's so like just ingrained into their psyche that they will do these terrible things to one another. I mean, the fact that it starts with Tantalus just deciding to serve up his son to the gods for for fun.
Yeah, seemingly to test them. Well, I don't know why they needed testing.
No, and
Like,
that he would choose his own son for that as well.
yeah.
It's so twisted, and I don't know. It feels like kind of a bit Game of Thrones, a bit Macbeth, all of these other like really sort of dark stories, and I was just really wanted to weave all of that in and to really make it feel like this horrible claustrophobic intensity through the novel just pressing down as these characters think that they've seen their escape and they think that they're going to get out, but instead they end up just getting sucked deeper and deeper in. I just think that's so irresistible.
Yeah, and the way that it can suck in the people in the
Mm-hmm.
periphery, you know, like Agamemnon and Menelaus are obviously affected by it, but that it can pull in, you know, this foreign woman, foreign, quote unquote, like Sparta's not that foreign, but you know, like Clytemnestra getting yanked into it, and like even Cassandra getting yanked into it in her own way is so interesting. Like just the way that it could like bleed out beyond the actual blood family members. And interesting what you're saying too, like Tantalus, they, you know, after he does feeds his kid to the gods, they go on to like, in terms of like the Greek mythology and the way it's referred to, like they're constantly like, oh yeah, no, Tantalus did this worst thing, like Tantalus was awful. Even part of the family is like discussing, you know, this Tantalid, like what he did and how horrific it is. And then I just love that they still get down to like Atreus, and it's like, no, but like maybe we do feed somebody his kids, like maybe that comes back, like maybe that wasn't, you know, the worst possible thing imaginable, and like let's look at it again. Like,
So let's revisit that for different reasons, and this time I'm sure it will go swimmingly.
exactly, like if we don't feed them to the gods then it's fine, right?
Yeah, completely. Just feed them to their own father instead. And the fact that Pelops, when he's saved, he's brought back by the gods. He gets his magical ivory shoulder, and all the rest of it. But then he still turns out to be an absolute like monster of a person anyway, because you would kind of expect that he would be the opposite to his father. And I guess it's kind of similar to Clytemnestra and Electra, that it just, this blood will out, it just comes through in their characters, and somehow they just can't seem to stop themselves from doing this over and making the same mistakes over and over again. That's very human, I think. Even though it's so lurid and so fantastical, there's just that kind of truth of human beings that, you know that this is probably a really bad course of action, but somehow you think that it's going to go okay this time, or that you've got justification. And so often that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Where it's like objectively you know these things to be true, but it's gonna happen again because of something or another, or just like your own inability to comprehend that, like, no, maybe your first thought of like this is a bad idea is in fact right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just find that whole curse and like the questions surrounding basically everything you covered in this book, like I just find it so fascinating to look at the ways in which each generation was affected by it, and like what happened because of it. And anyway, I love curses in Greek mythology generally, but this is the best curse in all of Greek mythology.
It definitely is. Yeah, it's definitely my favorite.
Yeah, it's just the most like wide ranging and like just I mean long standing, obviously. Also, I just like to be able to list all the three because they're just great words when you put them all together.
Yeah, that is also true. Very satisfying.
It just really is. So one person who's like such a sort of lightning rod, I think is the word I would like to use, is Helen, obviously. And she's kind of like on the periphery, in everything, which is sort of just like generally the notion of her character. She's on the periphery everywhere. But how did you like approach her? Did you have any like specific goals with how you wanted to handle Helen? Like she's such an interesting character for so many different reasons. So I'm just curious generally about your Helen.
Yeah, I think I found her quite an intimidating character to come to write, because she doesn't have, I mean, who kind of really is she in Greek mythology? She's used for so many purposes, and I think that the one thing that I knew about her was that she's the instigator, she's the catalyst for this terrible war, and that's so enraging and so nonsensical. The idea, and I have her say it in the novel, that 1,000 ships would sail for her. That this is a war about male ego. It's a war about conquest and territory and wealth and power. But so handy. Here we are. We can blame it all on one woman who is just so beautiful that we hate her because we want her so much. So that was I knew that kind of that was my feeling about Helen, but kind of working out who she would be and what would make her do whatever it is she does, and we don't really know what she does. There's, does she go with Paris willingly? Is she abducted? Is she turned into a cloud and spends 10 years in Egypt? We don't know. So yeah, and again, I thought, well, I want to try and see her a little bit more then through the prism of her female relationships, because kind of seeing how she relates to all these men, to Menelaus, to Paris, to the suitors or whoever else, isn't really helping me get an understanding of who she is. So I started with her and Clytemnestra back in Sparta and their childhood together, and that strange sibling relationship they have where they're twins, but Helen's been born from an egg because she's the daughter of Zeus, whereas Clytemnestra is completely mortal, and that kind of imbalance between them. And as Helen is the daughter of, like, not just a god, but she's the daughter of Zeus, the sort of the kind of the sort of like the king of the gods, she must kind of feel that she has got something important to do with her life, because all of the male sons of gods are going off and having adventures or quests or going to war, and what is she going to do apart from be the most beautiful woman, like just be a prize for these men? So that did make me think about her going to Troy and how she could have been tempted, like why she would have been tempted, maybe not really just by Paris, but by the promise of something new and something exciting and some kind of destiny that she could get hold of. but she's just so much the focus of other people's opinions all the time, um, that I did want to give her some little moments where she is just herself. So like where she interacts with Cassandra in Troy, because they're both in these kind of different but quite similar situations because they're both outcasts within that city. Neither of them are fully accepted for these very different reasons, and both of them are kind of viewed as being the harbingers of disaster. So I definitely thought there'd be a connection between them. I think while I was writing, I just felt, and I think you'll always feel like this with Greek mythology, like there's about 6 different novels that you could write just under the surface. And I was like, oh my God, a Helen and Cassandra novel would be great. Bring Andromache and like write all of their stories. And there's just not room in one book. But yeah, so I did as much with her as there was space, while kind of honouring those other characters whose stories I just thought needed to be heard this time.
I did love that moment, like Clytemnestra is kind of thinking about her and is like, did she go willingly or did she not? And I think that it's like a question that, I mean, even just the way you phrased it there, like that's one thing I find out about Helen to be so interesting is that I can see either side,
Mm-hmm.
even from a standpoint of like wanting to give her agency in both cases. Like, she could have loved either of them. Like, we just know so little that I think you can have a sympathetic and understandable like idea of Helen while also like looking at both of these options, and like both you can get, and neither really make her the bad guy, because she just overall is not the bad guy. Like, these men went to war because of their own fragile
Mm-hmm.
egos. They didn't go to war over Helen. Like, that's not actually how it works. And so I do like the idea that you can see her going with Paris out of love or out of desire to have a different experience, to have something bigger and better. And like, and even that, still you can look at that option and still be like, it still wasn't on her. Like, it's still all about the men and their egos. Like, the idea of her blame in that story has always fascinated me so much, because it's just, I mean, it's so just based in misogyny 100%, and like the patriarch, and this idea that like, yeah, sure, one woman caused a whole war that only involved men fighting. That checks out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Like a 10-year siege was a completely proportionate reaction to her leaving her
Yeah.
husband. Um,
Yeah,
but I
absolutely.
think like one of the first books that I ever read about Greek mythology when I was younger was The Tale of Troy by Roger Lansell Green. I don't know if you've ever read that. It's like a children's book.
Mm-mm.
And it was my first introduction to the Trojan War. And in it, Helen is a completely innocent character. It's Aphrodite has charmed her, and she doesn't know what's happening. And then suddenly she's in Troy with Paris, and she spends the whole time crying for her daughter that she's left behind, and Menelaus, who she really loves. So I think it was ingrained in me. Oh, Helen is a sympathetic character. I came across that representation of her before any other. So I think I would always have that kind of, yeah, it definitely wasn't Helen's fault kind of. In that book, he also
Yeah.
mentions that Theseus is awful. So, I mean, I'll recommend that book to
Yes.
any children.
Yeah, that sounds great, especially for a kid's book of Greek mythology. Like, it's a rare feat, I think, to have Theseus called out in something like that. That's great. I recently, and you kind of already alluded to it, but I recently recorded a conversation episode. I'm not sure if it'll come out before or after this, but regardless, I'm going to bring it
Mm-hmm.
up. But about the idea of Helen as the eidolon, like this weird version of her that actually is off in Egypt this whole time, and there's this like false like cloud Helen in Troy doing everything. That's just so fascinating to me. Like, did you have any thoughts about doing anything with that? I mean, it sounds like it'd be so deeply complicated, but I'm just so curious about your thoughts on that version of her.
No, all I did was I put in a tiny Easter egg where when Cassandra sees her, she says she's so beautiful, she looks as though she could have been sculpted from a cloud. And I just threw that in as a
Oh,
reference. But
yeah,
yeah, I found it not the place, I think, to actually make her a cloud and go into all of that.
yeah.
But I'll be so interested to listen to that conversation. That sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, and just now I want to do like a whole like accompanying episode on that idea of her, because it's so weird and unique for Greek mythology. This idea of like a false version of someone, and it feels like it would only happen with Helen, like only someone that controversial for no good reason. like would get that
Yeah,
treatment.
somebody so impenetrable that maybe she wasn't there at all.
Yeah, and just so like it's all down to her. So how can we make it, not, I don't know. It's fascinating
Mm.
idea, just this like version of her. This whole story is like so complex and there's so many different versions. I think the most interesting thing for me, and I'm sure you encountered this with Ariadne too, is the stories where there's like these mythical versions and then there's these tragedy versions, because like so often we have to link our ideas of Greek mythology on Greek tragedy, because that's where we get a lot of things where other sources are lost. But also the thing I always come back to is that like Greek tragedy was a performance. It was like a piece of like art. It was reception in itself. Like so we, it's easy to also then look at it and be like, well, grain of salt, like what did the playwright want to change for his own story, his own drama, like the idea of like what we change in a movie adaptation versus the original story and things like that. So did you have like preferences in terms of what you wanted to refer to, or like, I mean, just basically like what are your thoughts on that in general, because it's fascinating. I love Greek tragedy so much.
Yeah.
Now I'm rambling.
No, definitely. Yeah, I went all over with it. So I do feel like the most defining version that we've got of the main story is Aeschylus's Oresteia, and that was definitely where I started. But Clytemnestra is so compelling in that version, but Elektra kind of is not particularly. She doesn't, there's not very much about her really, particularly in the is it the libation bearers? I get confused with the titles. Oh my god.
Yeah, libation, I know I mix them up too, because you have some people call them the Greek, and libation bearers is the middle one.
So in that she's just, I mean, she's there and she follows the same story as with Sophocles and Euripides, but obviously Sophocles and Euripides called their tragedies Elektra, and there is so much more of her in them. So I was skipping back and forth between the tragedies, kind of like taking Clytemnestra from Aeschylus, taking the idea of the beacons lighting, which I love so much, but also doesn't make any sense because it makes it feel as though they get back from Troy in the space of one night. So I really wanted the beacons in there, but I had to find a way to make that make sense, which was tricky.
I wonder if they could have had beacons too. Like now I'm just thinking about distances and things, and like I don't know if that would have worked. Sorry, I had not thought about that before, but now I'm fascinated by the idea of like whether they could actually have had that from like Turkey to Argos.
Yeah, there's a lot of sea in between. So
exactly, and like some islands, but the islands are not close enough to each other. Anyway, sorry.
The beacons don't work on many levels, but I still really wanted to include them because I love them.
Of course. Yeah. I think they're great. I just more went to like, what it technically speaking, but no, they're a perfect plot device. Like, yeah, absolutely.
And I don't. Could they have had them on stage in the tragedy? Could they have had like burning torches?
Probably, yeah, you're right.
That would have looked amazing.
So if you think about it in that respect, it would have, and would have been like a gorgeous thing and an easy one. And they had pretty high tech, less so with Aeschylus, I imagine, but they would have performed those later with the tech. But like, I just always think back to the crane and stuff they had. Yeah. Like they did a lot with their stage work. So cool.
Yeah, that's gonna like take us down a rabbit hole of like, why can't we do time travel?
Greek tragedy. Oh my god! If you don't think I think about that like every single day. Oh my god. Yeah.
So yeah, so I was back and forth between Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus until I got really confused with where I was, and well, not so much confused with where I was, but kind of when I'm looking back and trying to unpick and work out, well, which bit came from where, because with researching all these different sources, I guess I find it all and then I have to turn it into something of my own, and then it's so difficult to then go back and kind of try and unpick where it all all came from.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously there's so much from the Iliad and then from the Odyssey as well. And then I couldn't write a book without Ovid showing up somewhere.
No one should.
Ever. Um, so but I do think with this story, more so than with Ariadne, the versions do mesh a lot more smoothly. I think with Ariadne there was so much that was contradictory, and it felt like there were versions from kind of so much longer before the Theseus story, that I was trying to smush it all together. I'll take that word again. And it was a lot harder to make those pieces fit. Whereas when it comes to Electra, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, there is a lot more that I think seems to agree when it comes to them, between the tragedies and between the poetry and the epics. There's character differences, and I think especially with Electra, she varies quite a lot. So she's very bloodthirsty in Sophocles. She's a little bit more conflicted in Euripides. There's definitely more depth to her character, and I don't know which order those two would have come in, but
no, that's interesting. Yeah,
but I think Euripides really kind of brought out more to her, and that was really useful to me. But whenever you come to Electra, there's still this huge gap in her life. There's just all of that time that went before you. By the time you meet her in any version that I could find, she's already grown up and she's already got this really fixed hatred, and there's no kind of explanation of in the ancient sources that I could find of where that came from and how that developed.
That's so true. Like, I hadn't really thought about it until you started saying all of that, but yeah, like there really are. It really is almost entirely just the plays in this case, because the Iliad doesn't really touch upon much of like the family, obviously, because they're back home, and like, yeah, you get the representation in the Odyssey, which is so interesting, but it's all about Clytemnestra, and yeah, so I guess we just have these like, I mean, luckily it's the only story that has been covered by all three of the tragedians, so it gets these like extra levels. But I would be wrong to not now add, or more like not, I would not be my own personality to not now add that in university. So I took my one like Greek drama class, which was the best, and I had the greatest prof, but he decided that like the way we were going to study the plays was that actually the only plays we were going to study were the three different tragedians' takes on that story. So we just spent an entire semester only studying like I think we went Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, because I think, yeah, timelines, that makes most sense. And so it was so fascinating to look at how they did it differently, because like, you're right, Euripides' Electra I think she's much more sympathetic. She's really interesting. But also Euripides' Orestes is bizarre. Like, the play called Orestes is like this wild ride of weird. I actually played Electra in a radio play version of that. It was great. We got extra credit for it and everything. All we did was like sit in a room with like 6 of us and just record this play nonstop. It was very fun.
That sounds really cool.
But I need to reread these plays. It's been so long. I don't even know if I've fully, like, I forget how I covered them in the podcast, because it's been like 4 years since I did it. And now like all I want to do is reread all the different takes on them, particularly because I love Euripides so much. But yeah, it's just fascinating the way they each have this story. So you get this like added depth of understanding and looking at how each of them handled it. And like, I mean, Aeschylus is obviously the oldest. He's like sort of the most like staid, and you get a great story out of him, but you get better characters, I think, out of Sophocles and Euripides.
Yeah. And there's a kind of that moment where Euripides like makes fun of the Aeschylus recognition scene, isn't there? And he's like, well, because I mean, obviously it does. There's the beacons, and then there are definitely some plot holes when it comes to Aeschylus. And he says, well, how could Electra possibly recognize Orestes from a lock of hair? People have got similar hair.
I was going to ask what it was.
Yeah, it's a lock of hair, and the footprint, I think, that her foot fits in the same footprint, and I mean would, because that's always true of brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
So I do really like that you have that little that reception of each other, that referencing of each other. It's so much fun.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just like to think about all those different things, like, because Aeschylus was like almost 100 years, I think, before
Mm.
Euripides, and he was so famous. So yeah, like everyone would have been like comparing or yeah, like criticizing or various things like that. So I love the intricacies of Greek tragedy. Truly, I could spend hours talking about it, but we won't turn this into that. Um, so I'm interested in how much you did or did not want to involve the Trojan War, because obviously, like, that's the most important. And like, did you? Maybe this also connects with like why you wanted to feature Cassandra, in this story, and sort of like what. Yeah, I mean, talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you're interested in Greek mythology, the Trojan War is just going to be something that you are always going to want to return to. It's just there's so much in it to love and to explore, and so I knew that I wanted the Trojan War in a novel, and I was trying to think, well, how can I do this that is not going to feel like it's just kind of rehashing what other people have done. Because I wanted to put my own slant on it, do something new. So seeing it from the inside of Troy was the main thing. That I didn't want to be out on the Greek beaches, kind of seeing Achilles and
Mm-hmm.
Agamemnon. Again, because that's been done so brilliantly. I've read The Silence of the Girls, I've read A Thousand Ships, I've read The Song of Achilles, and they are all amazing. And I'm not going to, try to do that again. It doesn't need doing. So going to try inside Troy was the first thing that really interested me, because I felt like I hadn't seen that so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what it was like to be in that city. I was writing during lockdowns, because this was 2020,
Mm.
and this idea of being under siege felt very timely, very relevant. The kind of feeling, that anxiety, and again, I'm going to use that word claustrophobia again, because that's really the pervading feeling of the novel. Um, really chimed and felt like something that was a way of kind of, I guess, like writing about the pandemic even without writing about the pandemic, because I'm 3,000 years
Mm.
ago and this is a totally different scenario, and it was a way of escaping but also channeling quite a lot of those anxieties and fears as well. um, and Cassandra has just always been a huge favourite of mine. I think she will be for so many people who are interested in this area, because she's just, her plight, her situation is so, oh, it speaks to you on so many levels. The way that she is a
Mm-hmm.
woman who is never heard and never believed. I mean, first of all, that's something that,
Is she always?
yeah, quite possibly. So she's, and I think, like, in a lot of versions, her brother is believed, isn't he? He's also a prophet, and so
Right.
so
Yeah.
there's something to chew over as well. Though I didn't include him in. I just kept it as her, for keeping it focused and kind of giving the spotlight to the people who deserve it. Um,
Yeah, you can't add too much in Greek mythology. It becomes a little messy, like as if the original works aren't messy enough.
exactly. And I thought, I don't want to have to put in a load of footnotes and have people like rushing off to an encyclopedia every 5 minutes. So yeah, so Cassandra, the fact that she can see what is going to happen to Troy, she can see how her city is going to be devastated. She knows it's coming, and shout as loud as she might, nobody will pay any attention to her. It's just so maddening and so fascinating, and so just just amazing to get into that mindset, and how, what it would be like, how it would actually begin to drive you mad, that everybody believes that you are mad. Um,
Mm-hmm.
she's just incredible, and she's so tragic as well. But she has these moments of defiance where she's still trying to save Troy, even though, why doesn't she just run away? Nobody there will give her the respect that she deserves. But it's her home, it's her city, it's where she belongs, and where she feels that, what kinship that she, she still loves her family, and she still loves her city, however badly they've treated her, and she's still going to do everything she can, um, even though she knows it's doomed to failure. It's so painful, that it made me just feel that she's somebody. Well, finally want to hear her voice and believe her story. So, and as well as that, there was kind of just the practicality of, this is a story about Electra and Clytemnestra is spending 10 years planning her revenge, which is great. It doesn't make for a very interesting novel if it's like day 42, still planning how to kill Agamemnon, all the way up to 10 years. So yeah, so to actually take the action to Troy and to see it happening, though it is difficult to write a character who can see the future and create a sense of suspense as well, because if she knows what's going to happen, how are you going to make it exciting? So the fact that she's an unreliable narrator in the way that these visions hit her, because Apollo is not going to give her like a detailed bullet pointed breakdown of like, this is going to happen when and where and how. It's going to be these kind of fits, these frenzied moments for her where she sees it coming.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, if we've learned anything from the Oracle, it's like Apollo doesn't speak clearly. No. He's not going to make it easy for you. But yeah, that's Cassandra's so interesting, and I think from like even the start in the book, she fits this great role too of, like aside from the fact that she's this fascinating character who I think, does deserve more of a voice, but also she's kind of there for it all. And there's not like a lot of details about her in the myths. Like there's very little. I did an episode on her and it was hard to tease everything out. But what she is that she does kind of serve as this sort of fixed point in much of Troy's story, even, from the very beginning of like what's going to happen with Paris. And I think that it adds so much that you get to have this character who links up then with Clytemnestra and Elektra in that very important way, but also serves to give you this like inside access to all of Troy and everything that happened there. So she kind of seems to serve like a very perfect plot device of, like you're saying, not having just the entire book be about Clytemnestra like slowly plotting her revenge, but also being able to look at the war itself through this character who is there and interacting with Helen and getting all these different insights. She just kind of is perfect for all of that.
Yeah, and because she's not involved, she's always this sort of outcast character. She's always got that separation from everybody else, and her vision isn't clouded in that way. She's not like one of the other characters who's really got like the skin in the game and so much involvement, because she's not a part of anything. She's separate all the time, so she can see it and she can relay it. And when Patroclus is killed, she knows that's not Achilles inside that armor. So it was like a good way to be able to describe that scene happening as well, that without it being really confusing, because everybody else in Troy thinks they're seeing Achilles die, that she's got this superior knowledge, so she's the person that I can turn to for what's happening there. And then she really serves a purpose to bring out something else about Clytemnestra's character when she's brought home as a captive, because this is something, and I think this came from Ovid, but it's certainly something I remember being told when I studied the plays back in college, when I was like 17, 18, which is that when Agamemnon brings Cassandra home, Clytemnestra is just consumed with this terrible sexual jealousy. And I just thought, even as an 18-year-old, I kind of thought, this does not ring true of Clytemnestra. She hates Agamemnon.
And when she's suddenly jealous he's got this concubine, which is the worst word ever. But
yeah, exactly. There's nothing that she's going to feel for Cassandra in that moment beyond pity that she is the property of this man that Clytemnestra knows is a monster and absolutely despises. I mean, there's maybe like an element of kind of disrespect in front of everybody. He's showing off his prize in front of his wife is there, but I just it's not jealousy. And that scene was just so crucial to me in drawing something else out of Clytemnestra.
And Clytemnestra, I think she deserves so much more than she's gotten in so many stories. So I'm thrilled with the way you've handled her, because she just deserves so much. I find her so interesting, and like, she just gets written off as this murderer, and like Sure, she is. But we can see why. Like, it doesn't make it okay, but we can see where she's coming from. Like, between her and Medea, I love the way that, even though they existed in this like deeply patriarchal mess of a world, and even though like all of their stories are in that, you can still tease out like what you did is not okay. I don't know why I keep having to say that. Like, obviously murder's bad. But you can still see how they got there. You can sympathize. You can like really feel it. And I think it just makes Clytemnestra so much more real. And yeah, you're right. Like, there's no way she was jealous. And I don't want to hear a version where she's jealous. Like, if anything, you're right. Like, there could be disrespect. She could just be like, well, this adds insult to injury. Like, he brought home a woman after all, on top of that. But yeah, she's certainly not feeling jealous of Cassandra. She's literally about to kill Agamemnon in this moment. And I also love that you made it Clytemnestra who does kill him. Because one, it was not always Aegisthus, and I don't want it to be Aegisthus. I want it to be Clytemnestra. Like, she didn't make him do her dirty work. He's just kind of there's this like supportive. I find him like this just supportive side character of like, yeah, he's there for moral support, but like the decisions are on Clytemnestra, and I think that really like adds something to the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the best moment in Aeschylus, when she comes out and she talks about killing him, and she says it's like the spring rains revitalizing the crops. That's what the spray of his blood was like.
Oh my God, that's the best line I've ever heard. I need to reread these. Oh man, it's been too long.
I think that goes right to the heart of Clytemnestra, and there's absolutely no way that she would hand that moment to anyone, and certainly not another man. Mm-hmm. That is entirely her moment, her becoming everything that she has been waiting for, and it really pays off.
Yeah. And sort of this just, it's sort of a departure, but just made me think of it. I also really enjoyed the way you handled the like Clytemnestra versus her children thing. I think there was a line that was just like, I hope this gives them peace or something, where it's like they, she also comes around to understand why her fate then has to happen. And it's just sort of, this is sort of her character, in all the versions, I think, is that she just needed to avenge Iphigenia, and after that it didn't really matter what happened to her. Like, it was just, she was consumed by it. That is what mattered, and like whatever came after, it is what it is. But she'd gotten that like feeling of righteousness against Agamemnon for what he did.
Yeah, completely. And because there is such a big contradiction in her character, that everything she does is because she loves her daughter so much, but then at the same time she has this terrible relationship with her 3 surviving children. So that was something to really kind of tackle in her character, and how that distance between them grew and became so unbridgeable, that gulf. But then ultimately she loves all of her children. And I don't think that you could have Clytemnestra not, because that's her motivating force. How much she loved Iphigenia, she is not going to not feel that for her other children as well.
No, exactly. She's just too overcome by what she feels about Iphigenia to like, have a good relationship with them. But at the same time, like, of course, like you're saying, that is her whole motivation. So she clearly still loves them in the end, even if, everything is tragedy in that story.
Yeah, it is. But the trauma that she went through, and the idea that you would take your daughter to be married and her own father.
Oh, like that story is just, it's just so much like somehow it feels recent, but it was already like 6 months ago now. But I covered the play, the Iphigenia at Alice, and it's just, it's such a moment. And I think, it's so important to be handled as what it is. And I think that's exactly what you did. It's like the most tragic thing in the world. It's horrific. Like, you literally are so excited. You think your eldest daughter is getting married. It's a good match. It's like life things being fulfilled. And then it then it just turns in the most horrific of ways. And like how do you deal with that as a human, and like how does that change you forever?
Yeah, it is this defining moment in her life.
Yeah, it is. I think it's so important that it is the defining moment for her, that it is. So yeah, it's all so much, but I think, yeah, I think you handled it all so beautifully, and I think it's such an important story to look at it this way. And I just love these people so much. So then I ran out of smart things to say about it, but I am so curious. This just came up while we were talking, but like, did you learn anything in your research, in your writing, that kind of really was just particularly exciting or kind of blew your mind or anything like that?
It's kind of, it's like it's not something that I learned. It was something that I had to fill in. It was just this idea about
Mm.
Electra's marriage and who and
Mm.
so in the Euripides, where he's just an unnamed peasant. I think that's
Huh.
he doesn't get any more than that. But he's like really virtuous, and he marries Electra, but it's like a sham marriage. He does it, so it just this has ordered it, because if she has children with a
Mm.
peasant, they will be inferior children and they won't grow up to avenge him. So it's his way out of the curse, because obviously he doesn't
Huh.
want, Electra's children to grow up and kill him. And they won't if they're commoners, obviously.
Huh.
So I wanted to work him into the story. But it also gave me a chance to see Electra through some slightly more sympathetic eyes, if she has got somebody in her life who cares about her enough to do that for her. And so I worked him in a lot earlier, and there's a lot of invention there. But that's because Electra's life up until then is such a void, it's such a blank. So I did want to give her a friend.
Yeah, yeah, I noticed that too, and I hadn't thought of like the original sourcing on it. I think what was probably good about going into it was that it has been a long time since I've covered these stories. Like, other than Iphigenia at Aulis, it's been a while.
Mm.
But yeah, that's great, and I think the fact that you got to invent so much about Electra's life in that in between, or just like her as a character too. Like, I think she's probably like a pretty ideal source to work off of, or not source but character, because she has a lot fleshed out, but there's still a lot that can be left to the imagination too, probably less so with Clytemnestra.
Oh no, definitely. Because I think with
Yeah.
Clytemnestra, as we've just said, we know exactly what drives her to that point of hatred and that point of revenge, and we can feel it and we can sympathise with it and we can totally understand it. But with Electra, the idea that she would get to that point, I mean, there are just some steps to fill in along the way, and she can't start out like that. She's not born with that kind of rage and that kind of hatred. So it's something that has to develop and has to evolve, and to kind of figure out how that would happen throughout the course of her life. That was definitely something to work with.
Well, then simultaneously too, you had to make her like at least mostly likable, or like you had to, like, you don't want the reader to also just hate her the whole time or think that she's wrong and stuff. So I bet it was quite a tightrope of like figuring out how to handle Electra
Yeah,
in that
and
way.
I hope that readers will find something to like about her, because it's definitely not her actions that you're going to like. You are
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
at any point going to be the way that, whereas with Clytemnestra, really, whatever your moral standpoint on murder is, you are cheering her on at that moment in her story,
Yep.
because if anyone ever had it coming, it's Agamemnon, and at her hands. But with Electra, it is a completely different situation, and I think that I don't think any reader is going to be. Oh, I'd be slightly worried if they are completely sympathetic to Electra. Um, but yeah, I really hope, because I grew to like her and to care about her during the writing process, even while being frustrated by how deluded she is and how misguided she is. I could feel like I knew where she was coming from. So yeah, I really hope that the reader does as well.
Yeah, I've always really liked her too, so that might have influenced me as well. But I just like her as a character who, I suppose it's mostly that like she's a woman in Greek myth who has a lot to say and that's rare.
Yeah.
So I've liked her.
Exactly. And she's got agency. She's decided what she wants, and she's going to do it.
Yeah, even if what she wants is not what we would like.
Yeah.
Yeah. This really has been so much fun. I'm so excited that we got to have this conversation. I think for me, like, I loved Ariadne and I love the myth of Ariadne, but like this is my story in a much more like visceral way, in a way where I'm like, I could talk about it so much forever. So I'm thrilled with like, I memean, just the book and you, and this is so much fun.
Thank you so much. I was so excited about talking to you about this. I'm really excited about the novel, and I'm so glad that you are too.
Absolutely. I mean, Greek mythology novels all the time. Like, I'm just so thrilled with how many are coming out, and I'm kind of glad I have this. I have you as like an author who I've had on before, because I get really intimidated talking to authors, or like I get the issue of like, I want this to be a conversation, but it usually needs to be an interview. So I'm very glad we had our background too, of we can just chat about this, because it makes it so much easier for me as a person who doesn't want to be an interviewer. I just want to have conversations with people.
Yeah, no, I think it's much nicer, and I love to talk to you because we get to talk about all the like nitty gritty of the myths and the characters, and it's so interesting to be able to go into that kind of depth and that kind of detail. So I love it.
That's exactly it. Like, I'm just thrilled I have somebody now who's like, well, I have all of this knowledge living in my head about these people, and now I can just throw it all at you, and you had all the answers. It's so exciting. But I also will say, and give myself a little bit of like, oh, this was very fun credit, but I did read the acknowledgements. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah, it was just amazing, like having your support with Ariadne, and the fact that you had me on the podcast twice. And I think that you were the first interview that I did. When I came on
I remember
to talk about Phaedra, and it was so nice. And I remember like I finished that and I was like, this is fine, I can do interviews, because you're so easy to talk to, and getting to be on a show that I loved was obviously like a bit of a dream come true. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm still like, I'm still anxious in my interview, so I'm still glad to hear that too myself, even though I talk to people all the time. But yeah, it was a thrill. I screenshotted it and sent it to Jen and Jenny this morning, just being like, "Aw," and they were like, "Yeah, we know." I was like, "Well, you should have sent it to me if you've already seen it. Like, come on."
Yeah. Yes, is same with them. Just it was you were all my lockdown companions. Your podcast. So.
I'm so glad. It's very fun. I mean, I love knowing that anyone writing mythological work at all are listening to me. So it's an added thrill. Absolutely. So really, again, thank you so much. Why don't you? I realize I've just kept referencing the book, but we haven't actually talked about like when people can get it. I will put everything in the episode's description, and I will provide like a bit of an introduction, as I always do. But do you want to tell listeners a little bit more about how and when they can get it, and anything else you want to share about the book or you?
Yeah, so it is out on the 28th of April in the UK, and then it will be out in the 3rd of May in North America.
Oh, so close. That's
yeah.
And I hate having to wait.
Yeah, in hardback, audio, ebook, however people want to get their books, and it's available wherever you get your books. So please get it.
Perfect. Yeah. Did you want to anyone to follow you at any places as well? Any social media you want to share?
Yes, of course. So I'm on Instagram, jennifer.saint.author, and I'm on Twitter, Jenny Saint.
Wonderful. And I will add all of that into the episode so people can find you. So generally, just thank you again so much for doing this.
Well, thank you so much for letting me.
Oh, nerds, as always, thank you so much for listening. I am so thrilled with how many mythological retellings there are these days. So many interesting ways of looking at these ancient and timeless characters. Bring on the novelizations. Still, I particularly love when those authors become friends of the show. It was such a joy chatting with Jenny again, not least because I get to openly just turn it into a conversation rather than an interview, because I fear the pressure of formal interviews, but also because I get the chance to pick authors' brains about turning myths into novels. It's such a fascinating thing and such a unique way of going about these myths. I'm often so deep in the myths themselves that I can't imagine fictionalizing something, so it's something that's just so interesting to me. Plus, I get the joy of just speaking with someone else who's somehow even deeper into this myth than I am in my daily life. That's a thrill. It's rare. And now all I want to do is reread the different plays that feature this story. I will absolutely cover it again one day. I didn't remotely do it justice all those years ago. I barely even compared the plays. Can you imagine the nerdery that will be involved when I do it again with my obsession with variations and looking at how each of the playwrights handled different things? Oh my God, it's going to be a lot. It might be obnoxious, but also fun. But I'm getting ahead of myself because honestly, I have so much planned for the future of this show, so many plays I haven't even remotely touched yet. And now I'm rambling. So thank you to Jennifer Saint for coming on the show. So much fun. And make sure that you, listener, grab a copy of Elektra. You will find links to Jenny's social media and beyond in the episode's description. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith handles so many things. God's just everything at this point. She's wonderful. We have an intern this month. Isn't that cool? First intern ever. Grace Roby is helping out with God's so many things. The podcast is hosted and monetized by Acast. Thank you. You are all the best. What a cool job I have. I am Liv and I love this shit.